Okay, so we're just going to have a look at a basic mix in this session. The first thing that I wanted to do is just have a look at the track here, which is made out of a combination of stems from the Flume Vera Blue track Rushing Back, but also other additional parts that I have created to mix in with the stems, additional synth parts, also a drum part, and so on. So this is a sort of a hybrid mix of the original tracks from Rushing Back, but also stuff that I've put in as well. So just running through the tracks here, you can see that I have a drums part just created simply with the boom instrument. It's really basic because I haven't even bothered to step program all of the beats. I'm just using patterns. And so you can see here in that MIDI part there that there's really only a few notes where it's just changing patterns. There's a second track of boom here, which is hi-hat flourishes and fills that occur at certain points. So I've just done that as an overdub. Then we have a boom kick, which is I'm running through a distortion. We have a bass part that I've put here, which is using the UVI workstation plug-in instrument. And then we have a second different bass sound that I've also programmed using a Brainworks Oberhausen analog synth model as well. Then we have what I'm calling space notes. These are just kind of like flourishes. I'm using Falcon as well for these. And then we've got a pad where I'm just using one of the presets that's in the expand instrument, which you have. And then an arpeggiator, which is also from expand. And you can see these just sort of come in at different points, and this sort of points back to an arrangement. And then we have a bunch of Flume synths, so a filter synth, a mellow synth, and then these kind of flute and vocal flourishes that he does throughout the track. So they're all from the Flume stems. Then we have Vera Blue's vocal, which again is from the stems, and the backing vocals as well, which are from the stems. I've also set up some effects, just some basic effects for this mix, a long reverb, a short delay, and then a longer delay, which I will speak to in a minute. Notice that I have created a master fader, so it's very important when you mix that you first create a master fader, otherwise you cannot see the levels that are leaving your session, okay, and that will be your mix level. So it's absolutely critical that you create a master fader, and there are videos on how you do that. So before you even start mixing, you really do need to have a master fader that's on the end of your session. Okay, so looking at the mix page here, you can see all of these parts. Now, it's often helpful to help you navigate your way around the parts to color code the tracks. It just makes them easier to look at and easier to find things. So, for example, here, I'll just show you how to color code. So if I wanted to make all the drums one color, I'm just going to shift select drums, JK, hats, fills, and boom. And then if you double click on the colored bit at the bottom, track color code, you'll see pops up, double click on that. And we could make them red. Okay, so my drums are now all red. I could then make my bass parts a different color because bass is sort of a functional element within a mix. So I could make them, let's say blue. And then I've got a range of different pads and so on here. These are all kind of different synth parts that come together. I could just choose to make them one color, shift click them, double click, and then make them maybe green. And then the vocals and the backing vocals, I could give them a color. I can maybe make them yellow. And then my effects returns coming down here, maybe a sort of purple color. So that's given me a nice color coding of my mix window so that it's just easier for me to see all the functional parts of my mix. You'll notice also that what I tend to do is, obviously you want to have all your tracks named according to their content, but that you can double click on these notes areas underneath each track and actually append a note to it. So I could just say up, flourish here. And then we will have further information about what's on that track. And so when it comes to the effects returns here, you can see I've got a long reverb, which I'm putting on Vera Blue's vocal. And so I can say main vocal verb. And then this short delay I'm using on the Flume hooks. Okay, those riffs that come throughout the track. Okay, so that's given us a kind of a mix window that's color-coded and easier to look at. And then also I have marked out the different sections of the song. Well, I've partly done that so far. I could keep going where I've got, verse 1 drums in, and it just means that I can jump to different parts of the song. I haven't completely added all of the markers, but I would recommend that you add markers throughout the song so that you can define all the various sections. So, when you're mixing, you can jump between chorus 1 and chorus 2, or verse 1 and verse 2, and just compare how those different verses or different choruses sound in relation to each other as you're mixing. We have talked about arrangement, but it is quite interesting to see in a track like this, there's not a lot of tracks, but they all serve a purpose of being able to keep the track moving. So a really important point to make about mixing is that it's all well and good to be really good with EQs and compressors and all of this sort of thing, but a really big part of a mix is actually the arrangement. And so it's really worth working as hard as you can on the arrangement to get a sense of movement through the track before you even attempt to start mixing, because ultimately the arrangement does a lot of work for you in the mix by having parts come in and out at various points and to create a sense of development or movement through the track. So what you don't want to do is to just sort of have a track where everything just stays the same for the whole track. That's going to be relatively boring in most situations, and you're going to want to think about each part of the song and introducing new elements for each part of the song, which will serve as a point of interest for that part of the song and create a sense of development or movement through the track. So you can see that is all going on in here. There are different parts coming in and out for different parts of the song. You can see the structure of the parts across the timeline. I might, just before I move on, just quickly also revise the fact that whenever you're in the edit window or in the mix window, you can control how much information you see in these windows. You'll see that I've got the instrument view open because I'm using a lot of instruments in this mix, but also I've got my inserts visible, so my plugins visible even in my edit window. And refresher, how you do that, you go view, in this case it's the edit window, and I can just select or deselect whatever it is that I want to see in this window. And likewise, when I am in my mix window, I can go view, mix window views, whatever it is that I want to see there as well. Okay, so you can see I've already put some plugins in. I'll go through that in a minute. So that's kind of got us on a basic starting point of the mix. The first thing I would do is just to get basic balances by pushing faders around. And remember that we're all aggregating across to this master fader. You can see there's already a clip there, which I will clear. I will talk about that in a moment. So let's just have a listen to what's here.
I always let the day slip away. I should have been making up my mind. I never opened up, took it all in, and now I'm running out.
And we can just do some basic balancing, setting the vocal where it needs to go. All right, we just want to jump to different parts of the track.
Making up my mind. I never opened up, took it all in, and now I'm running out of time. Sometimes I dream about going back, keeping all the things I left behind. But now I know you can't change the past. Way too young to know the reason why. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, so you can just wait for the entry of all of the parts and just get a basic balance of how they're sitting relative to each other. So you're just getting things to sit basically well together through just moving the faders around and getting a basic balance to begin with. It's really good to try and do as much mixing as you can in context, where you're making all of your moves, not just by soloing tracks, but also listening to how those moves work in the context of everything else that's happening around it. That's a really key mixing principle. Okay, so that's going across to the master fader. As you can see, we're clipping that master fader at the moment. I can just pull that master fader back just a touch for the moment to stop those clips.
Making up my mind.
Just jump forward.
And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, so I'm peaking up in the top 6 dB of the range, it's worth looking at the metering. So if you right click on a meter in Pro Tools, you can see various different kinds of metering. If I want to just set it to sample peak, which is just absolute digital level, you'll see it goes up to 0 here. Okay, so that's a good way for a beginner, is just to have it on sample peak, and then you can just see absolute level leaving Pro Tools, and you can just check how close you are to clipping. Okay, so we push the faders around and then we get a basic balance. And then obviously we can start to EQ tracks from here. So by applying EQs on whatever elements we need to, typically most elements can benefit from a bit of EQ to help to shape them into the mix in various ways. And so you've got the Vera main vocal here. I can put a EQ on it. I'm just going to use the simplest EQs that we have, just a Pro Tools standard EQ here. One of the really interesting things about EQ is that it does affect the perceived balance of something in the mix, and this is a really important concept. When it comes to achieving balances in mixes, it's not just about pushing the faders around to get a balance, although that gets you part of the way there. You find that once you start EQing sounds, that things will come into the foreground or go into the background of a mix. Ultimately, you're dealing with a sort of a spectral profile of the whole mix. And so, an EQ will actually affect the perceived balance. If I put more mid-range into something or more high-end into something, it's going to appear to be louder in the mix, even though you haven't changed the fader level. So let me just demonstrate that with, say, the vocal.
Faster than it ever has before. When I was 17, nicotine loving had me.
So if I've just, that's a bit nasty, but if I've just pushed 3.5K on her vocal, see how much louder it seems to get, right?
Faster than it ever has before. When I was 17, nicotine loving had me rushing out the door. I try to hold it back, take a breath, looking at old pictures on the floor.
Okay, so that's a really clear indication of how EQ affects perceived balance. Okay, so what you're sometimes doing when you want to get your vocal clear, sometimes it's an EQ thing to get it to sit at the right point in the mix. It's not necessarily just a fader balance thing. So, it's a set of judgments between a good vocal sound, so something that's not too piercing, not too bright, or not too dull, but also where there's sufficient presence in the mid-range frequencies in order for that vocal to sit into the foreground of the mix and not get buried by the things that are around it. So EQ is a very important tool for balancing as well as shaping sounds. Let me just see if I can get a rough vocal EQ on this at the moment.
Faster than it ever has before. When I was 17, nicotine loving had me rushing out the door. I try to hold it back, take a breath, looking at old pictures on the floor. But I hear everything to me, you don't have to try to let it go.
I could put a little bit of compression on her vocal. This is a stem, so it's already got a little bit of compression on it already. But if I wanted to, I could go to dynamics. I would prefer the Pro compressor over the standard Pro Tools one. This is the more sort of slightly more sophisticated compressor. So let's have a listen to her vocal through this.
Faster than it ever has before. When I was 17, nicotine loving had me rushing out the door. I try to hold it back, take a breath, looking at old pictures on the floor. But I hear everything to me, you don't have to try to let it go. Faster than it ever has before. When I was 17.
Okay, that's just reined that vocal in a little bit. It's, about 3 dB of compression. It's a ratio of 3 to 1, so it's not squeezing it too hard. It's got a moderately fast attack, so it'll catch all the consonants on the front of words, and a moderately fast release, so it'll let go of the vocal quite quickly. We then have a make-up gain, so obviously if I'm pulling level off it, then I'm also going to want to put a little bit of level back into it so I can get it to sit at the right level that I had it before. So now I've got a kind of a containment on that vocal with just a bit of EQ, bring it into the foreground, and a little bit of EQ just to hold it in position. You know, it's not sounding obviously smashed with the compressor, it's just really reasonably transparent. It's just catching those peaks so that that vocal sits in the mix. It doesn't sort of leap out or get buried too much. It's sitting at a more consistent level. I won't go through the creation of sends because we have looked at that before, only to say that it's very important that when you have reverbs and delays that you set them up as sends and you do not use them as inserts, because you don't have sufficient control over effects processing if they're placed as inserts when it's a delay or a reverb. So you can see that I've set one reverb here as a send and then two delays, and on the main vocal I have a long reverb on that vocal which I've set up as a send with a named bus. So in our I/O setups, I've gone to new path, I've created a named send or a named bus which is reverb long, and then when it comes to setting up that send, I go to the send control, I go to bus, and then I choose reverb long. Okay, so that gives me a reverb send from the main vocal channel, where I can vary the amount going to the reverb, and then the return here, long verb. You can see it's going into an air reverb. You can see that it's set to 100% wet, which is very important when you're using things as sends, not as inserts. It's got a 3.3 second reverb time. So if I just solo this channel,
I feel the gravity pulling me faster than it ever has before.
okay, I can vary the amount of reverb going to that send from my send fader. So that's my vocal reverb. It's very hard to tell how much reverb you need on a vocal if you're not listening to it in context. So
I feel the gravity pulling me faster than it ever has before. When I was 17, nicotine loving had me rushing out the door.
okay, so I've just listened to the vocal in the context of the track to decide how much reverb it needs, and you can really only hear that when you're listening to the vocal in the context of the mix. Okay, you can't really get any sort of sense of it when you've just soloed the channel. So that's my reverb return. It's an air reverb, and it's at the moment just used on the main vocal. And I've done the same thing for the Flume hooks. This is kind of subtle because it just widens it. It's a very short delay. So if I was to go to a section of the Flume hooks and just solo this channel, have a look at this delay short. It's going to a multi-delay. It's super short, 152 milliseconds. I can sort of play around with that a little bit, but notice that it's also on 100% wet. Just have a listen to that sort of stereo effect. It's got no feedback on it, so there's not many repeats if I was to turn that up. The tail would get a bit longer. Okay, it's just giving it a sort of a stereo widening effect. So it's not an overt sort of repeating delay. It's a very short delay that just kind of slaps back between the left and right speakers, and it just puts that Flume hook thing in a different space in the mix. And it's kind of helpful just to put things out a little bit wide so it's not sitting in the center competing with the vocal. So we'll have a listen in context.
And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, so those backing vocals are dry at the moment. We might want to put a delay on them. So let's just put a delay on those. We would then go to the send on the BV channel, and we would find our long delay, which is going into this one called dynamic delay, 100% mix again, and it's timed as a division of the BPM. So if you have the sync button turned on, it will actually time the delay time into musical values. So you can see if it's an eighth note, if it's a triplet or a duplet, and so on. So it's musical divisions. If you've got this sync button turned on, which is helpful in these kinds of tracks, because you want these delays, if they're going to be repeating delays, to be in time with the track and not out of time with the track. So let's just have a quick listen to that.
And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, if I was to put that up against the click track, if I right click it and make it active.
And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, so that's in time with the track. So I've checked that against my click. I'll just mute my click. So it's just balancing this up. Let's just play the track. I won't solo it, and I'll just play with the return level.
And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, can turn the feedback down a bit so it's not so long.
And it all comes rushing back, rushing back.
Okay, so you can sort of govern the length of the repeats by the feedback control, so how long it's going into those repeats for. Okay, so I've now set up something on these backing vocals that gives them a delay repeat, just to add a bit of interest in the mix. So let's just sort of have a listen to how a verse unfolds into a chorus.
The gravity pulling me faster than it ever has before. When I was 17, nicotine loving had me rushing out the door. I try to hold it back, take a breath, looking at old pictures on the floor. But I hear everything telling me you don't have the time to let it go. And it all comes rushing back, rushing back. 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 All the years, all the
Okay, so it just gives a little bit of interest on the back half of that bar after the rushing back backing vocals happens. A bit of that sort of delay repeat coming through the texture and the back half of each of those bars. So it just sort of keeps the whole thing moving a little bit and adds points of interest as those backing vocals unfold. So these are really simple techniques in using effects just to, and I think the point here about something like this delay is it becomes an arrangement element of its own, a delay. It's not just kind of about putting things in space and in the mix, but when it comes to things like delays and delay tails on things, they do become like musical elements in the arrangement that can be used to really good effect. So that's a good example of that. I'm just going to, in this video, set up the basic elements of the mix. So we're looking at balances, we're looking at things like EQ, we're looking at getting a few effects happening and getting some of the effects working for us in terms of arrangement elements, and we're getting them all moving across to a master fader where we can build the mix to a reasonable mix level. I did have to sort of tweak the master fader a little bit so I wasn't clipping my outputs, but we'll look at the whole question of shaping the mix and the mix level as a separate video. Also, we'll have a look at the concept of introducing automation into the mix. So we're able to vary the mix elements, the positions of faders, the positions of sends, and the amount of effects that are happening through sends through automating those processes with the automation functions that Pro Tools can provide to us. But that gives you sort of a basic overview of just setting up the mix, color coding your tracks, creating a master fader, putting markers into your track so you know where all the various sections of the song are located, and then setting up some simple sends so that you can get some effects happening through the mix.